the subject of governance, insecurity, and economic development in our beloved African continent. There are those who now say that the problems of Africa have been overanalyzed and that therefore time for action is now. To such as those, I remind them that the Africa we are talking about is Africa in the post-colonial era, and the oldest of those countries is Ghana, which only attained independence 60 years ago. Not that I'm discounting Liberia, which again regained independence in 1847, but I'm alive to the fact that the bulk of the African countries that we talk about today and that we mention every so often were colonial constructs. It is for that reason, therefore, that a conversation of this nature must necessarily begin by looking at the history of the modern African state. And I'm using the word modern very guardedly and instructively to talk about the nation that was created by the colonizing powers. Africa is today divided into 54 officially recognized states. I'm aware that the people of Sahrawi make a claim to their statehood, but they are not recognized. I'm equally aware that the Ambazonians make a claim to their nationhood, but they are not recognized. But let us ask ourselves how these nations came into being. These nations came into being, and we all know, courtesy of history, when the European powers settled in Berlin in 1884, and when they assembled there, their main reason was to ensure that they exploited Africa in a coordinated way. And the way was coordinated in a manner that ensured that if the British had their spheres of influence, they did not interfere with the French. And if the French had their spheres of influence, they did not interfere with the Germans. And the Germans did not interfere with the Portuguese, and the Portuguese did not interfere with the Spaniards. That is how we had our countries puzzled in the manner that we have them today. So pernicious was the entire process of the partition of Africa that sometimes it saddens me that the Africans don't talk about reparation as loudly and as passionately as they should. But voices are beginning to emerge, and one assumes and hopes that they will be coordinated in order to give prominence to the sense of guilt that the European powers ought to have when they are dealing with Africa. It is that Africa that we are talking about. But the Africans were not colonized without resistance. Africans were resisting in the West, they were resisting in the South, they were resisting in the East, they were resisting in the North. And after the World War II, which I normally refer to as the tribal war of the Europeans, after the Europeans had slaughtered themselves in 1945, and the colonial project was no longer viable, they started listening to voices of reason. And the United Nations, which we know was created in 1945, in the absence of all African countries in San Francisco in the United States, came up with a resolution for the freedom of colonized peoples in 1960. But that is not the time when African countries had started agitating for independence. A casual reading of history, whether it is the history of what we now call Nigeria, or what we now call Mali, or what we call Kenya, or Uganda, or Tanzania, will inform us that the struggle had started in earnest much earlier. But it is Ghana that blazed the trail. In the month of March 1957, Ghana regained her independence. And there is a sense in which when we use these foreign languages, and English is such a language as such, we must use words correctly. We did not gain our independence, we regained our independence. When we regained our independence, we promised each other, and indeed the people who supported our founding fathers were clear that the reason why we were expelling the colonizers is because we recognized that our dignity could only be restored if we regained our independence. And if you look at even the informal works of the great thinkers of the day, whether it was Nnamdi Azikiwe here in Nigeria, or Obafemi Awolowo, or Tafawa Balewa, or even Sardana of Sokoto, Sir Ahmadu Bello, whether you disagreed with him, there was that recognition. If you went to Mali and you listened to Modibo Keita, you recognized the clarity and the passion with which he spoke. And if you went to East Africa and listened to Julius Nyerere, or even Jomo Kenyatta at that time, or Kaunda at that time, there was a sense in which there was unanimity that Africa could only realize her potential if she regained her independence. So it was joy and celebration in Accra, Ghana, on the 6th day of March, 1957. But Kwame Nkrumah, whom we sometimes refer to ad nauseum, was the clearest of all leaders in terms of thinking and articulation of what Africa needed. While the Ghanaians were celebrating on that day, he reminded them that the freedom of Ghana did not mark the end. Indeed, he told them that the freedom of Ghana meant nothing if the rest of Africa was not free. He reminded his audience that indeed they must remember that the only reason why the people of Ghana entrusted them with leadership is because they believed that they would do better than the colonizers, and that if they reneged on that promise, the same forces that were marshaled to remove the colonizers would be marshaled to remove them. That was the message of Kwame Nkrumah. So that the Africa that we inherited was an Africa that had promises, and those promises were loud and clear. If you listen to the leaders of the day, whether it was David Dacko speaking in Central African Republic, he was saying that we are freeing ourselves from the French because we think we can do better. Whether it was Ahmed Sékou Touré speaking in Guinea, he was saying we can do better because we are now free. Whether it was Amilcar Cabral speaking in Guinea-Bissau, the message was one and clear. But the question is, history having been analyzed and understood, is Africa the better today? Is Africa punching at our weight? Is Africa realizing our potential? Have the promises of independence been achieved, whether you look at North or South or Central or West or Southern Africa, or the leaders reneged on their promise? I remember so very vividly when in the month of May, on the 24th and 25th days of May to be exact, the leaders of Africa assembled in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, each one of them convicted, each one of them resolute, each one of them clear, and saying with one voice and unanimity that Africa had to be united. And what stood out on that day was that everybody, even the ones who turned out to be monsters a little later, were clear. And some of the speeches that stood out on that day were those of David Dacko of Central African Republic. And I choose David Dacko because subsequently he did not perform very well. But he said, our country is so small that if we do not work with fellow Africans as a united front, we will be recolonized again. The other voice was that of Modibo Keita from Mali. The other one was that of Julius Kambarage Nyerere. He reminded his audience on that day, we have come here not to remind ourselves how important unity is. We know that it is important to be united. But the most eloquent and the most passionate and the most urgent voice of the day was that of Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah. He told the audience, we Africans must come out of this place united with one country, with one army. We must come out here with one currency. We must leave this place as the United States of Africa, because if we don't, the neo-colonial project will torpedo all the things that we have worked for. But they listened to him not. They listened to him not, because they took the view that the growth of African unity must be gradual. They listened to him not. And therefore we came out with a body called the Organization of African Unity, whom commentators then described as a bulldog without teeth. But sometimes I ask myself, was it ever a dog at all? But we had it nevertheless. And therefore, over the years, we started recognizing that Kwame Nkrumah was right. We started recognizing that he was right, because the neo-colonial powers were always alive and well. In 1960, no sooner had Togo settled in our independence than they took away Sylvanus Olympio. The French activities were not that subterranean, they were overt, and we could see them. The Belgians were not overt. Barely 9 months after they had regained their independence, the Congolese had lost the man for whom I am named, Patrice Emery Lumumba. And soon thereafter, we had coup d'etats. If there was no coup in Mali, there was a coup in Nigeria. If there was no coup in Nigeria, there was one in Togo. If there was no coup in Togo, there was one in Dahomey. If there was none in Dahomey, there was one in Liberia. If there was none in Liberia, there was another one in the Gambia. And if there was none in the Gambia, there was one in Uganda. And if there was none in Uganda, there was one in Rwanda. And if there was none in Rwanda, there was one in Burundi. And if there was none in Burundi, there was one in Somalia. So that Africa became the home of coup d'etats. And one wonders who was engineering those coup d'etats. There are those who say that Africans are in the business of blaming their former colonizers. But the truth is that they must be blamed, because they continue to be alive and well. They continue to be alive and well in surreptitious ways. You know, I often ask myself, what was the significance when the British left us? They created something called the Commonwealth. Some will say that it has been useful. But why is it, if it is a community of independent nations, why is the chair and the president and the head of the Commonwealth perpetually the monarch of England? Why not Nigerian president? Why not Ugandan president? No, the Commonwealth is a body that is created to give the British a sense of perpetual ownership for their lost kingdoms. And the reason why we must recognize that, why is the United States not a member of it? And it was a former colony of the British. The French have their own, where they bring together all the former French colonies, and is headquartered in Paris. And to the French, it doesn't stop there. They even control their currency, and they don't stop there. They even have their armies in the countries that they control, and they don't stop there. They even tell you who to elect, and they don't even stop there. They tell you where to invest, and they don't even stop there. They want to tell you what to do, and they don't even stop there. They come and exploit your resources, and they don't even stop there. They want to tell you how to run your laws, and they don't even stop there. They tell you who to send to jail and who not to send to jail. The colonial project is alive and well. And if it is not alive and well in France, you go to Portugal and you ask the Angolans who control the affairs. Even weak Portugal still controls our countries. If they don't control Portugal, they can't control Guinea-Bissau. And if they don't control Guinea-Bissau, they control Mozambique. And if they don't control Mozambique, they control Sao Tome and Principe. And if they don't control that, they control Cape Verde. Africa is still a continent that is controlled by others, which reminds me, one of our problems as Africans, and I remember Samora Moises Machel of Mozambique talking about it in 1982, that sometimes he's amazed by Africans. When Africans sit and compare the colonizers, those who are colonized by the British, say, our colonizers were better than yours. And those who are colonized by the French say that your colonizers were better than ours. And he said, how can slaves sit and say that one slave master was better than the other? Slavery is evil and colonization is evil. Why is this necessary? Some may wonder. Why must we rehash all these? Because it explains some of the problems that we still have here in the continent of Africa. Which brings me to the subject of insecurity. You know, only yesterday I had a visit from Professor Utom at night, not like Nicodemus at night. But he visited me, and during our conversation we got talking about insecurity in Africa, and we agonized, and he came out with something that I thought was inspired. And this is what he said, that sometimes Africa and the African continent is so deep in water that even a ripple will make Africa drown. And that therefore going forward we must ask ourselves, what must we do in order not to drown? And I told him, do you know that the Organization of African Unity has declared that the year 2020 will be the year when the guns will be silent in Africa? And I went further and I told him that we must never confuse silence for peace. Africa may be silent, but Africa is not peaceful. And I want us to look at Africa today and have a look at the map of Africa and tell me, is Africa at peace? Is Africa at peace when blacks in South Africa tell their brethren in Nigeria to go back home, but they don't say the same to the Chinese? Is Africa at peace? Is Africa at peace when Zimbabwe is restless? Is Africa at peace when the rebels are still active in Mozambique? Is Africa at peace when Somalia is not at rest? Is Africa at peace when the results of the election in Malawi have not been settled today? Is Africa at peace? Is Africa at peace when Eritrea still grapples with our internal problems? Is Africa at peace when South Sudan still have to visit the Roman Catholic Pope to kiss the feet of their leaders to persuade them to have rapprochement? Is Africa at peace when Sudan does not have peace and calm? When Darfur is still under African Union forces? Is Africa at peace when Burkina Faso still have to call in the French army? Is Africa at peace when Mauritania and Mali still have the French to intervene? Is Africa at peace when the Casamance in Senegal still calls for their independence? Is Africa at peace when Togo is not at peace, when Guinea-Conakry is not at peace? Is Africa at peace when kidnapping becomes the occupation of some young men in Nigeria? Is Africa at peace? Africa is not at peace. And the question is, what is the result and what is the reason of this insecurity that undermines our very being as a people and undermines socio-economic development? The reason is that when Africa is not at peace, then there are those who benefit from it. If you look at many countries in the world, even the ones that you think are innocent, if you look at some of their largest exports to Africa, it is weapons. If it is not landmines, it is bullets. If it is not bullets, it is other weapons that they bring to the continent of Africa. They create war that they may be peacemakers, and when they've made the peace through the war that they created, then they are nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. This is the Africa that we are talking about, an Africa that is normally defined from outsiders. It is an Africa that it is always looked at and spoken about either in past tense or in future tense. Africa used to be great. Africa will be great. They never say Africa is great. I look forward to the day when the past tense and the future tense will not be used in reference to our continent. I look forward to the day when we shall say of Africa, you are great and great now. But as I speak now, insecurity abounds in the continent, and each one of our countries is never too far. Many African countries are between the intensive care unit and the graveyard. It is our duty to ensure that we do not allow them to slip to the other side. The net effect of African insecurity is that it brings about poverty. And poverty is one of the biggest industries in the world. You know, I think about Africa very often, and I read about Africa very often, and I know that there are many Africans and non-Africans who have written about Africa. And one can think about many who have written about the continent of Africa, and it's good to take advantage of the history that we have heard about the continent of Africa. Only in the last 1 month I've been rereading the works of a man called Martin Meredith, and he talks about the state of Africa and analyzes it so very well, how she is rich, but paradoxically our sons and daughters are the poorest on earth. I read Martin Meredith again when he talks about the fortunes of Africa, and it says that how this continent was so rich that at one time when a man called Mansa Musa left Mali on a pilgrimage to Mecca, he had so much gold that the world did not recover from his riches for several decades. When he says that Mansa Musa was possibly the richest man that the world has ever seen, he talks about the riches of Africa, yet paradoxically and ironically, Africa is the poorest continent on earth. I read about Africa, and I know that the Democratic Republic of Congo is the richest resource country on earth, that every mobile phone that we have has an ingredient which is only found in the Democratic Republic of Congo, coltan or rare earth. And it's not lost on me that no African country manufactures a mobile phone until very recently, when Rwanda and South Africa started assembling mobile phones. No African country manufactures a mobile phone. And I do not stop there. I know that Africa has some of the most medically beneficial plants in Africa, and I still know that in order to cure our own, we've got to import medicine that is made by Novartis or Bayer. And I still know that when our leaders are sick, unless they are suicidal, they'll never attend a hospital in Africa. They go to Europe and America. And yet Africa is rich, but nothing happens. I know that we have some of the best possible sources of electricity. Is estimated that the Grand Inga Dam in the Democratic Republic of Congo can generate enough power for the continent of Africa, and I still know that Belgium perhaps has more light and more electricity and generates more energy than the entire continent of Africa, excluding Algeria and South Africa. And I also know that Iran produces more power than all sub-Saharan countries combined. I know all that. Africa is rich, yet she is poor. I know that Africa is a market. We produce oil, but as Ali Mazrui rightly said, Africa produces what she does not consume and consumes what she does not produce. I do know that Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana produce chocolate, but the best chocolate that we buy is from Switzerland and Belgium, who do not know what a cocoa leaf looks like. I do know that Ghana, Nigeria produces bitter leaf, but bitter leaf is now patented in the United States of America. That is Africa for us. What and who manufactures this poverty? Are we co-authors of our own misfortune? Have we lamented for too long? Has time come that Africa must stop lamenting? Lament we must, but we must not end at lamentation. Greg Mills, a South African thinker, argues, and I agree with him partially, that African countries are poor because their leaders have chosen that path. But I also want to add that even the population have urged them on, because in many African countries, when we are given the opportunity to elect men and women into public office, we elect men and women whose claim to fame is that they want to undermine everything that we desire. We are given opportunity to elect and to run our politics in ways that are not understood by us. So Greg Mills is right. It is leaders who make a choice that their countries must be poor. But that is only a part of the story. The other part of the story is that the neo-colonizers persuaded us very early on that we can only thrive when we are given aid. And for a long time, Africa was given aid, but was it really aid? The things that we are receiving from the European Union, receiving from France, receiving from the United Kingdom, receiving from Germany, was it aid? No, it was not. It was their way of atoning for their sins, but they never say it. Indeed, the truth is that the thing that they call aid can never, ever satisfy and solve our problems. Once again, the young Zambian girl, Dambisa Moyo, in her little book, Dead Aid, says, you cannot expect to liberate yourself from poverty by receiving aid. But why is it that Europe is always in the business of creating structures where we are granted aid? How many of you here will forget the Lomé Convention of 1975? You'll remember when the European powers met in Lomé, Togo, and they came up with the African, Caribbean, and Pacific, and they told us that our path to growth was through aid that was administered by them, and we believed them. When Lomé was dead, they met again in 2000 in Cotonou in Benin, and they came up with yet another arrangement. And when that stopped, they came up with the structural adjustment system in the 1980s. Africa is always a laboratory for the ideas of young men and women who are working toward their PhDs in Yale, in Harvard, and in Cambridge and in Oxford. They are doing all these while the University of Lagos is not doing anything, while the University of Dar es Salaam is doing nothing, while Makerere is doing nothing. The time has come that we must ask ourselves, what can we do to fight poverty, which has served to dehumanize us? And they do not stop there. Whenever We think we want to do our own thing. They are quick to come with their own things. They came with something called NEPAD. And there is a man whom I do not like, but this idea from him I liked. Yahya Jammeh of Gambia. He said when they talk about NEPAD, what it really means is that they are knee pads that we wear upon our knees and kneel before them as we beg. And there is a sense that if you want to ask yourself, what is the product and what are the dividends of NEPAD? Is Africa the richer because there was NEPAD? If Africa has progressed, it was in spite of NEPAD, not because of it. But Africa has never tired. I remember in 1980 here in Lagos, Nigeria, Africans, having recognized their problems will not be solved by others, came up with the Lagos Plan of Action. And the Lagos Plan of Action recognized that if we want to trade with ourselves, we must work together. But the Lagos Plan of Action was dead on arrival. Africa still does not trade with ourselves. So that today, here in Nigeria, you love rice, but you do not produce enough rice. You go to Ghana, they love rice, but they import 1 billion worth of rice from the Asians. Africa produces what she does not consume and consumes what she does not produce. Africa is the home of NGOs. Some call them nothing going on. And there is a sense in which nothing goes on. There is much motion without light. If NGOs were to solve Africa's problem, Africa would be in the first world. For which country in Africa does not have NGOs dealing with water? Which country in Africa does not have NGOs dealing with poverty? Which country in Africa does not have NGOs dealing with farming? Which country in Africa does not have NGOs in all sectors? Why is it that despite all these, Africa is still where she ought not to be? We have been lulled into a false sense of security. Writing in 1983, Chinua Achebe, in his little book, The Trouble with Nigeria, said that many Africans suffer from what he described as the cargo cult mentality. He said, not me, Chinua Achebe, the belief by backward people that without any effort on their part, the thing that they have always wanted will arrive at their port of hope without any action on their part. The belief that you can get things that are under the bed without bending. The belief that you can use the magician's pronouncement of abracadabra and lo and behold things come without effort. The belief that you can get things that require effort without effort on your part. Chinua Achebe summarized and said the problem, he said, of Nigeria at that time is that the problem of Nigeria is simply and squarely a problem of leadership, and which is true not only of Nigeria but true of most of Africa. We are poor. But yet also, we must interrogate this thing called poverty. We have been told that the only measure of success is something called the GDP, and that this GDP is further divided into per capita income. When you go into many African countries, you'll find that one person can have the per capita income of 1 million people. Is the GDP indeed a correct index of measuring how successful we are doing? Or we must now go to the way of the Bhutanese and have another index called the Gross National Happiness Index. But let us not confuse excitement with happiness. Sometimes people are merely excited, but are they happy, and what will make them happy? All human beings want to have the quality of their lives to improve. Today, when we talk about poverty, we are asking ourselves, can Africans have food on their table? When we talk about poverty, can we have and ensure that Africans have potable water when they are thirsty? When we talk about poverty, we are asking ourselves whether our young men and women can get opportunities. We are asking ourselves whether Africa can feed ourselves. We are asking ourselves whether Nigeria is capable of supplying sufficient food for our people, whether the Democratic Republic of Congo can do so. I remember so very sadly when there was the mad cow disease in the United Kingdom, and one of the most insensitive members of parliament in the United Kingdom said, all these meat that we are throwing here in England because of the mad cow, take them to Africa, let them eat. Even if they are dying, they were dying anyway. That is how Africa looks at the world. That is how the world looks at Africa. Have we brought it upon ourselves that the world looks at us in that way? Which brings me to the question, when we talk about economic development, is that the route that we will now use to liberate the continent of Africa from the chains of sorrows and lamentation? But even before I talk about that, I want to talk about the thing that is called governance. What is governance? Because governance is at the very heart of how we conduct our affairs. Today, many African countries have been made to believe that there is something called democracy. And listen to my choice of words, something called democracy. Who defines that democracy for Africa? Paris does so. London does so. Brussels does so. Washington does so. The conceptual West does so. After the many coups that took place in Africa in the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we were told that the only thing that will liberate Africa from dictatorships is democracy, and this is how they define democracy. You must have many political parties, multi-party democracy. Once you have had multi-party democracy, you must have periodic elections after 5 years. And once you have had periodic elections, your presidents must have a limited term. And after they have had a limited time, you must have a free press. And after you have had a free press, you must have the civil society. And when you conduct your elections, call in observers. The observers will come from Africa, they will come from Asia, but the opinion of the Asian observers don't matter. The opinion of the African observers don't matter. The opinion of the European Union matters. When they say the elections were free and fair, then they are free and fair. And if they did not say they were free and fair, then they are not free and fair. I want us to look at Africa after the reintroduction of democracy as defined for us. Here in Nigeria, after every election cycle, whether you like it or not, the country is never at ease. In Kenya, after every election cycle, whether they are successful or not, the country is never at ease. In Uganda, the country is never at ease. In Burundi, the country is never at ease. They never tell Kuwait that they are not democratic. They never tell Bahrain that they are not democratic. They never tell Oman that they are not democratic. They never tell Brunei that they are not democratic. But they are so quick to tell us what to do. The net effect is that in many African countries, when there is an electoral process, The participants in the electoral process are sometimes mere puppets, and the puppeteers are sitting outside of Africa. And we are fighting proxy wars. I say this because our systems of governance is what will inform economic development. Let us now ask ourselves, what is this thing called economic development? But before I go to that, let us look at the international architecture of governance. First of all, we agree that in 1945, when the United Nations organization was being put together in San Francisco in the United States of America, the many African countries that we know today were not there. It is their colonizers that were there. What is never lost on me, that after 1945 in San Francisco in the United States of America, about 3 years later in Paris in 1948, they came with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the same year that they came with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that is when the apartheid regime in South Africa was being founded, and European powers did not say anything about it. It is not lost on me. It is not lost on me that is in 1945 that they came up with a structure which say that you have certain permanent members of the United Nations, and that those permanent members, the vote of one of them can neutralize the votes of all African countries. It is not lost on me that when the United Nations meets, you have a meeting of all nations which we claim are all equal. But if the United States vetoes, then that is the end of the matter. If the United Kingdom vetoes, that is the end of the matter. So the 1 billion of us, with our 54 heads of state, we can say all we want, but little France can neutralize them with a single vote. That is the architecture of the international world. And when the G7, I do not know whether you have ever seen, and I know you have, when there is a meeting of the G7 in the recent past, they invite leaders of African countries. Nigerian president is normally invited because you are the most populous nation on Africa, and 1 in every 5 African is Nigeria, and therefore you are a big market, so they invite your president. They also invite the chairman for the time being of African Union, and then they take a photograph. After that photograph, our leaders disappear. You never hear about them. And yet there is another meeting of the G20. Once again, you discover that we are not there. In other words, the architecture of the international economic order does not take care of Africa, which means that we are orphans in international affairs. And if we are orphans in international affairs, it begs the question, what is it that we must do in order to immunize ourselves from the activities of our erstwhile colonizers who still control the economy of the world? Let us look at economic development today. All African countries combined last year, our GDP at the very best was no more than 2 trillion United States dollars. The GDP of the state of California was $3 trillion. The population of the state of California in the United States is slightly under 39 million. It means that the 1.2 billion of us, all the goods and services that we generate in 1 year is still less than the 38 million generated by the 38 million citizens of the state of California. We are divided, we are so weak, and it is because of our weaknesses that we cannot do well. Look at our currency. Africa has nearly 32 currencies. Here in Nigeria you have the Naira. In Ghana they have the Cedi. When you carry your Naira to Ghana, the Ghanaian market woman will ask, what is this? When you carry your Cedi to Liberia, the Liberian Baba will ask, what is this? But when you carry the almighty dollar, they will quake in their boots. All our currencies are soft currencies, because if they are hard currencies, all the others must be soft, because the opposite of hard is soft. How can we compete in the world? Nigeria produces oil and exports most of it, only to re-import a lot of it. How can it be? How can it be that when we are exploring oil, it is ExxonMobil, it is Shell, it is Total, it is Elf, it is Tallow that takes care of our oil? How can it be that we produce gold and our gold is traded in London? How can it be? How can it be that we have diamond in Sierra Leone and we have diamond in Botswana and diamond in Namibia, but the price of diamond and the quality is determined in Antwerp in Belgium? How can it be? How can it be that we produce coffee in Kenya and in Ethiopia, and yet it is Nestle in Switzerland that produces Nescafe? How can it be? How can it be that we produce tea in Kenya and in Uganda, but it is the English who talk about the English tea, and not a single bush of tea grows in England? How can it be? I say all these because economic development means value addition. We can only begin to grow economically when we are talking about value addition. What value do we add? You know, in the recent past, excuse me if I'm paranoid, but paranoia is part of the solution to the African problem. In the recent past, I've seen African heads of state being called to Japan by the Japanese Prime Minister to talk about the place of Africa in Japan's economic agenda. Then I've seen them called to Beijing in China. Then I've seen them called to Dubai in the Arab world. Then I've seen them being called to Sochi in Russia. Then I've seen them being called to Germany last week. What is it that people want from Africa? Why is it that Africa is so attractive? Do people love us so much that there is a competition for us? Yes, they love us so much. Because we are the bees that have the honey. But does the bee know how sweet the honey is? I suspect that we do not. How is it that our young men and women are running out of the continent? But if you travel to any African country today, there are young Chinese between the ages of 20 and 35 coming to Africa. There is not a single country that I know today that will not talk of a road that is built by a Chinese company. If it is not a road, it is a stadium. If it is not one such as that, then you have a Chinese restaurant, which the middle class think is a sign of success. Economic development is what I'm talking about. If I look at Africa today, the world is talking about the fourth industrial revolution. We are talking about robotics. We are talking about artificial intelligence. We are talking about the Internet of Things. We are talking about Facebook. We are talking about Signal. We are talking about Instagram. We are talking about cryptocurrency. We are talking about all these things, but where is my beloved Africa in the scheme of things? Where are we? Do we produce a single mobile phone? No, we don't. Do we run any internet marketing tool? We don't. Jumia was founded here in Nigeria, but by French entrepreneurs with a sprinkling of Nigerians. Half of it is now owned by MTN. So we shop from Jumia. We are told that is Africa because it has an African name. We are losing out. We lost out in the first industrial revolution. We lost out in the second industrial revolution. We lost out in the third industrial revolution. We are losing out in the fourth industrial revolution. So as I said at the beginning, we now humor ourselves by saying that those who built the pyramids were African. So what? It is good to humor ourselves with that history, but I'm talking about food on the table now, not the Sphinx in Giza. Africa will only realize her economic development if she begins to move in the right direction, which is what brings me to the last question of my conversation with Africa. Where is Africa going? And is she going anywhere at all? Yes, she is. You know, when I look at Africa, the colonial powers designed the post-colonial African state to fail. That was the design. That is why here in Nigeria, while the North was being administered separately with the South, on the eve of independence, they were put together in the hope that it would collapse. You have defied it. Nigeria is still alive and well, her trials and tribulations notwithstanding. They did the same in Sudan. Administered separately on the eve of independence, they put it together. Unfortunately, it did not stay for long. In the year 2001, it was split into South Sudan and Sudan. The colonial state was designed to fail. But over 50 years after independence, we have managed to weld our countries together so that we have some kind of diversity. And that is why I can still hear Kwame Nkrumah and Julius Nyerere, through the vicissitudes of time, say, we inherited artificial boundaries, but let us not redraw them. Because if we start redrawing those boundaries, which country will not be at conflict with each other? Let us only unite. And that is how I understand where Africa is going now. In the year 2013, African states met in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And they were celebrating 50 years after the creation of the Organization of African Unity. And I remember the chair of the OAU then was Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma. She wrote an imaginary letter to Kwame Nkrumah, telling Kwame, you are right and we were wrong. 50 years ago, you told us to unite. We did not unite. 50 years ago, you told us that we should trade as one united country. We did not. 50 years ago, you told us that our safety would be guaranteed by our unity and unanimity on the things that affected the continent, but we did not. Today, We have recognized our mistakes, and we are saying what the Catholics would say on a confession: mea culpa, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. And having said that, we come up with Africa Agenda 2063. Africa Agenda 2063 is a promise to you, our founding fathers. A promise that if we lost the last 50 years, we'll not lose the next 60 years. And not in so many words, but in effect, Nkosazana and Dlamini Zuma was saying, in the next 50 years, by 2063, Africa will be industrialized. There'll be an equivalent of the Silicon Valley in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Africa will have anchors in the west of Africa. Nigeria, the sleeping giant, will be alive and awake, and ECOWAS will not be the same again. In Southern Africa, South Africa will have shaken the vestiges of apartheid, and she will be the anchor of SADC. In East Africa, we will have Kenya and Ethiopia as anchors, and Tanzania will also make a contribution. In Central Africa, that country that is bigger than the entire Western Europe, the Democratic Republic of Congo, will no longer be a basket case of the world, but she will be the food basket of Africa. And that power will be generated from the Inga Dam. Down in Namibia, solar power will be harnessed. In the Maghreb, the Arabs will have been persuaded to determine that the Africans are not to be Africans when it is convenient, and Arabs when it is inconvenient. And that therefore Africa will become a continent that we can speak of. Africa Agenda 2063, in my view, are the first baby steps which herald a realization by Africa that Africa can only unite if she speaks with one voice. There are those who are beginning to question whether Africa Agenda 2063 was dead on arrival, and before they could say, yes, indeed, Africa met in Kigali, Rwanda, and came up with the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. And I'm happy that under the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, the Secretariat is already being established in Accra, Ghana. And from the month of June next year, Africa Continental Free Trade Area will begin to operate, and Africans will begin to trade with Africa. And when that begins to happen, it will no longer be necessary for the border between Nigeria and Benin to be closed at Sem. It will not be. It will no longer be necessary to close the border between Nigeria and Ghana. It will no longer be necessary to close the border between Rwanda and Uganda. It will no longer be necessary to close the border between Kenya and Tanzania. It will no longer be necessary to close the border between Zambia and Botswana. It will no longer be necessary to control the border between Lesotho and South Africa and Eswatini and South Africa. Africa will be trading as one. Will these things happen in your lifetime? Perhaps not. So this is not for the faint-hearted. This is not instant coffee solution. Our duty is to do what we must and to run the relay race that like it must be run. You run your leg well and hand over the baton to the next generation. It can be done and it will be done, because if it is not done, Africa will not realize our potential. But even as I say what I am saying, wisdom demands that I must now move to the conclusion of my conversation. And that wisdom tells me that in Africa today there are two categories of people. There are the Afro-pessimists and there are the Afro-optimists. The Afro-pessimists are the ones, if you permit me to use this cliche, whenever the glass is half full, they will always say that the glass is half empty. The Afro-pessimists are the ones who will always say, as somebody once correctly said, for every solution they find a problem. I want to declare here and now, I am an Afro-optimist. And I'm encouraging us to be Afro-optimists. And when you are an Afro-optimist, you are in good company. When you are Afro-optimist, you are in the company of many good men and women. When you are an Afro-optimist, you are in the company of Kwame Nkrumah, because he believed that Africa could realize our potential. When you are an Afro-optimist, you are in the company of Julius Kambarage Nyerere. I remember so very vividly on the 6th day of March 1997, when Julius Kambarage Nyerere had been invited to speak in Accra, Ghana, and he was speaking on the subject of African unity. He said, inter alia, that I come here to confirm that Africa can only grow if she is united. And it pains me when I see that we little countries are putting premium on our Ghanaian-ness, our Nigerian-ness, and our Tanzanian-ness. In the scheme of things, what is Tanzania? In the scheme of things, what is Nigeria? In the scheme of things, what is Ghana? In the scheme of things, what are our little countries? He says that the beauty of Africa is that the rest of the world still treats her as if she were one. And she reminded his audience that if Africans are going to commit any sin, the sin that they must not commit is the sin of giving up hope. I am an Afro-optimist in the nature of Julius Kambarage Nyerere. I'm also an Afro-optimist in the class of the man for whom I am named. Patrice Emery Lumumba died at age 36 when called upon to write a letter to his wife. He had 2 wives, 2 of them, 4 wives in fact. 2 of them had the same name, Josephine. So when the letter was released to Josephine, they were jostling. It was Josephine number 1 or Josephine number 2, but that does not matter. The letter was written and he said, I know that I'm going to die, but my joy, even when I die, the Congolese and the Africans will now write their history and their story. I'm an optimist in that regard. But I'm also an optimist a lot more with due respect to the economic circumstances of the continent. I'm an optimist who believes, like the young Ghanaian economist writer Dambisa Moyo, that Africa will only rise if she does not look at aid as the solution to our problems. I'm only an optimist in the class of Dambisa when she warns us that China and India and the West have appetite for our resources, but we cannot blame them. We must blame ourselves, because in the nature of things, we must trade with China, we must trade with Europe, we must trade with America, but we can only trade from a position of strength. I am an optimist like my own fellow countryman, Professor Calestas Juma, who in his book, The New Harvest, says, we can only feed ourselves if we begin to embrace innovation and invention. I am an optimist who believes that Africa can rise, Africa will rise, and Africa can rise. And I'm an optimist who believes that those of you who are present here are the ones who, in the nature of things, must now embrace what I call the Holy Spirit of economic development. This, in a manner of speaking, is the day of the Pentecost. And I'm now saying, let the Spirit fall upon us. Let the Spirit invade our hearts and minds. I started at the beginning by saying that I was preceded in these lectures by a great man. I was preceded by Benoit Boueze. And when he spoke about constitutionalism. Let constitutionalism have meaning when we talk about governance. And I think that it will have meaning. I was preceded in this particular regard by Ali Mazrui when he talked about democracy. Let democracy be defined by us. I was preceded by John Aelaigu. I was preceded by Professor Utom, and I was preceded by Kingsley Mohalu. I was preceded by great men, and I am in the presence of great men who believe that we can solve our problems of governance, we can solve our problems of insecurity, we can solve our problems of poverty, we can solve our problems of economic underdevelopment, and we can only do so if we embrace the things that change nations. Let us today do so. God bless you.